Good evening. Welcome to tonight's budget hearing and Meet the Candidates Night. My name is Karen Nerney. I'm a public information specialist through Capital Region BOCES, and I have the pleasure of being assigned to Mohonasen. Tonight, we will start with our budget hearing with Mr. Ruberti, and then we'll move into the Meet the Candidates portion. But first, I wanted to welcome and acknowledge Mr. Shannon Shine, who, as many of you know, was appointed as our next superintendent, and he will begin on July 1. So thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So we'll start with Mr. Ruberti, who will present an overview of the proposed 2018-19 spending plan, and I'll welcome you to come up.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go through things a little bit differently than we have in the past for the budget hearing. The reason for that is that during this budget process, it's been particularly difficult. We've had, obviously, a lot of planning meetings, but where we ended up in the budget, we had to make some reductions in staff and some cuts. So we wanted to make sure to address some of the concerns and some of the questions that had come up during that process and try to give some extra information. But to start off with, we are going to do a general overall review of the budget process itself. So starting off kind of the at-a-glance budget, where we ended up. A little over $53 million is the adopted budget amount. It's a little over a 4% increase in the actual spending and a 3.21% increase in the tax levy. It's important to note that that 3.21% is the tax levy limit calculation that's part of the state formula, and we'll go through that as we go through the presentation itself. But I know even just today in the paper, there's still, it's been several years now, but there's still a little bit of a perception that the tax levy limit calculation is a 2% calculation. And while that's one factor in the calculation itself, it's certainly not where it ends up. And so I know one of the things in the paper today kind of alluded to that and may have been a little bit misleading. So if we start to look at kind of a review of the process and how it happened, over the course of the budget development, we find out different factors. We start off with a rollover budget, which is basically taking all of our current staff and programs, look at what they would cost in the following year based on contractual increases and those types of things. And then as we get more information, whether it be about health insurance, workers' comp, those types of things, we plug those numbers in. And so as we move along in the process, we get closer and closer to what ends up being the final budget and the final number. Unfortunately, oftentimes, we can start off with a little bit of a budget gap, and as we find out some of our revenues and some of our expenses, we're able to close that gap down, not end up where we were this year, which is making reductions in staff. This year, when that final process was done, we had still about $1 million gap. And it was due to a variety of different factors. Some of the ones that you see up on the screen: health insurance, teachers' retirement, workers' comp, our contractual increases. Those were major factors in the expenses. And then, as you know, most of our revenues come from a combination of the tax levy and our state aid. And we'll talk about those a little bit more. So the question is, how do you make up $1 million? So the factors that went into this, and there were a lot of long discussions, based on the percentage of our budget that is salary and benefits, unfortunately, there's not a lot that you can do other than to reduce staff. So the total reductions, though, that we were able to make from non-staffing positions was about $100,000. That includes reducing supplies, reducing conference money, some of the summer curriculum, different stipends that were in the budget. And that $100,000 would be the equivalent of about 1.5 teaching positions or full-time equivalent positions, regardless of if it's, we look at it as being about $75,000 for a full-time position. And that's kind of doing an average of support staff positions, teaching positions, and administrative positions. But then the rest came from staffing. And those staffing cuts are 12 total FTE, and we'll look at what those are. But the things that you have to remember with that, and part of the drivers within our budget, is it's not just the salaries, but it's also the benefits. So when you make a cut to salary, it also changes the impacts on the retirement systems, on Social Security, on health insurance costs. So that whole $900,000 is not in salary expenses, but it's a combination of salary and benefits. And then one of the things that the board did toward the end of the process, right before adoption, was also allocate another $50,000 of fund balance with the idea that if we ended up with another section of kindergarten, that it would be able to be staffed that way. So if we look at those reductions, you'll see that by far the biggest one was 7 elementary sections, 7 total FTE in the elementary. It didn't end up being 1 per grade level, but we'll look at some of those class sizes. You also see that there was phys ed, an admin position, an ENL position, a high school social studies position, part of a business position, and then the bottom 3 that you see there are strictly related to when you change elementary sections, there are corresponding special areas that go along with those, and with less elementary sections, there was less of a need for art, music, and phys ed. So those cuts at the bottom, those reductions at the bottom, were strictly due to having fewer elementary class sections. There was also a small increase in social work and a part-time teacher assistant that were added for programmatic reasons. So if we look at those average class sizes and what the sections are, you'll see them here. I'm going to go through this relatively briefly because I know we've looked at it a few times because I want to show it to you in a little bit of a different format in a second. This is one of them, and what it does is it takes a look at the class sizes over several years. And one of the things that you'll see, and for those of you who have been with us for several years, is that the board has made a concerted effort over time. If you look back to the 14-15 year and almost 26 students in a class through the elementary, and then all the way to 17-18, which is this year, down to an average class size of 21.5, to reduce those class sizes, and that's what made this budget so difficult and so hard to make those reductions, because it has been such an important thing that the board has focused on, is trying to get those elementary class sizes as small as we can. But you'll see that this year with the reductions, it's back up to about 24.5, which is similar to where it was back in 2013-14. If we take a look at kind of those big picture pieces of both expenses and revenues, I just want to highlight a couple of things, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but you'll see on this slide that by far the biggest dollar increase and percent increase is in employee benefits. And so that is a combination of the teacher's retirement system and our health insurance costs. Now, the other one that stands out in here is debt, and I'll talk about that too, but the important thing to remember with the debt service piece is none of that money can be used to go toward instructional programs. The money that increases in debt service is a combination of state aid and other funds that are part of what's called a debt service account, which can only be used toward capital expenses, and then also part of an exclusion within the tax levy formula that can be used toward capital expenses. So in this case, one of the things that you'll see is that our debt service amount that we owe went up about $860,000, but actually the amount of state aid that we're getting back for our building projects is over $900,000. So the impact of that increase in debt isn't felt anywhere on the instructional side, and actually we have a little bit more revenue than we have debt compared to last year. So if we look here, and again, you'll see state aid stands out, and on the surface it looks great, and that's why sometimes you need to dig a little deeper. You see a 6% increase in state aid and almost $1.3 million. About $950,000 of that is building aid, specifically going to offset that increase in our debt costs that we had. So, you know, whereas on paper, if you looked at it in a vacuum, it looks like a huge increase, and unfortunately that's not money that can be accessed to be able to fund instructional programs. One of the other things I want to point out on here, and this will get to in the Q&A as well, is you see that the BOCES rental went up about 35% and about $150,000, and that's from increased use of the CAT building and the relationship that we have with BOCES. So also another important note. One of the ways that we need to look at the budget is in what they call a 3-part budget breakdown, and it breaks the budget down into program, capital, and administration. And essentially, if you think about it, program is everything that has to do with kids, whether it's their teachers, the clerical staff in the offices, the monitors, the people they come into contact with on a daily basis, all the sports-related items. Capital is a lot of our capital debt, but also our operations and maintenance staff. And then administration encompasses all administrators, supervisors, a lot of BOCES administrative costs, legal fees, and those types of things. This is the actual calculation for the tax levy. And I won't go through the whole thing here, but basically what it shows, the main factors are there is a 2% increase this year based on the CPI. And the CPI is the Consumer Price Index, and they calculate it every year. And as long as it's over 2, we can use 2% in the calculation. And then that's statewide. And then Mohonasen also has a 0.42% local growth factor. So it means that the last time that they did kind of our tax base, we grew by about 0.42%. Based on that increase in our tax base, we're able to levy that much more money. When you add in the capital exclusion, that's something that we do every year. And basically what that is adding on the debt that we've had from the various projects, and specifically for the last several years has been the $48.2 million project that we're nearing completion on. And so when you go through all those calculations, it's 3.21% is the actual levy calculation. And again, is within the limit. So what does that mean for an average taxpayer? I know there is no average, but what we've generally done is look at a $150,000 full value house and what would that impact be. And the estimate right now, and we know from last year, and if we have Guilderland residents here, you guys know that when equalization rates change or your assessments change, it can have a huge impact. So we have to go with the assumption that those will stay the same, and if they do, a $150,000 full value home would be about a $75 increase in their taxes for the year. So that's a relatively quick look through what we would typically go over in this presentation. But what we wanted to spend some time on is there's a lot of questions that have come up that are very valid questions, and they've come up from the community, they've come up from our staff, they've come from the board, they've come from us internally to say, okay, so we're in this position where we're reducing positions, where we have a shortfall in the budget, and taking a look and kind of analyzing some of these things and some of the questions that we've heard is helpful for us to do internally, but we also feel like it's really important for the community and the staff to know kind of some of the information that's here. So one of the big ones is going to be, and I'll get into detail with these, is the health insurance cost, because there has been a huge increase in the past 2 years, and we'll talk a little bit about that. The Center for Advanced Technology, it is a big, shiny, beautiful new building, and it's very valid to think, okay, so how did they build this building, but they can't pay for their teachers? How the staffing reductions appear to impact teachers more at a higher proportion than the rest of our staff, specifically admin, and then within the teaching staff, why so many elementary positions. The idea of using fund balance, and can we use fund balance to bridge this entire gap and just not have layoffs? Talk a little bit about state aid, specifically foundation aid, and then why are other districts not in the same position that we are? So we're going to try to go through those relatively quickly because I want you guys to be able to meet your candidates tonight. But these are important things to go over. So starting off with health insurance, there's a couple of main factors. One, and for our staff that are here, they know we have what's called open enrollment every year in the month of May. We adopt the budget in April. We have open enrollment in May. When the budget is also approved, but we don't know during open enrollment, which is basically a time that our staff can choose to then take health insurance or not take health insurance and change what they did the prior year. Based on our new staff members, we estimated 7 or 8 new health insurance plans that we would have, and we had more like 17, which is great, and we want people to use our health insurance, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it created an additional cost that was not anticipated. So that we are now anticipating carrying over into 18, 19 as well, because most of the times when people get on insurance plans, they don't come off of those plans. So that was an increase. However, the much bigger one, and the one that we've talked about in more detail, was we had this very large increase in prescription costs now 2 years in a row. So when we developed the budget last year, we had this over 23% increase in prescription costs. And typically when that happens, you see it flatten out as time goes on. And we're self-insured for our drug coverage. What happened was not only did it not flatten out, it continued to escalate. We ended up with a 30% increase this year, and it was actually recommended to be more. But we capped it at 30%, taking a little bit of a risk, but also knowing that if we increased it any more than that, it would also mean more reductions in staff. So being self-funded, one of the questions became, well, does that seem like a very good idea when you're having these massive cost increases? So one of the things to think about, in the three out of the 5 years prior to those 2-year increases, we had 0% increases in our prescription rates. And we'll talk more about that. But it's also important to note that our actual medical plans and the way that we're set up through what's called CASHIC, the Capital Area School Health Insurance Consortium, actually had much lower than average and what medical trend would be increases in those medical plans. Those medical plans over the last 5 years, we have 3 different major medical plans, averaged about a 4% increase, whereas medical trend was about 6.5%. So CASHIC actually over time has saved us a lot of money. We think it's a great plan to be in. It doesn't mean that we can't always be looking at things. But it really has been a lot of savings. And specifically to the prescription rates, if you look at this, if you look at 16, 17 before we had those 2 spikes, what's up here in the charts is to show what the low rate was within CASHIC. So at the time it was 15 districts. The lowest rate in CASHIC for an individual plan, other than Mohonasen, was $121, almost $122. The highest rate was close to $250, and the average was $176. So before these 2 years, This is for an individual plan. It was about $65 a month less than what the average was within Kashyyyk, which is also less than what the market would give you. So even after those 2 years, so now as we go into 18, 19 and have access to all of the rates of other districts, is the district that was at 121.97, they've actually had multiple years now of 0% increase, so they're still there. But you see the high rate went up to about $300 a month. The average rate went up to about $212, and now we're at $174. So we are still, even after those 2 years, 18% below what the average rate is within Kashyyyk, which is now 19 districts, which is well below the average rate of what you would get on the open market. So absolutely, it's been a huge increase, but it's also important to remember that relative to other people and where we are, it's just hard to absorb. There's no way to just absorb that increase and not plan for it into the future when it happens, but to kind of jump ship and go from this model that we've had that's been so successful wouldn't really be prudent. So the next thing with health insurance has been asked a lot, and again, very valid. What can we do to mitigate costs? We still, even with the prescription success that we had for many years, we're always looking at new things, and Kashyyyk as a whole is looking to develop a relationship with another benefit company that might be able to offer us similar drugs with more discounts, which is one of the ways that those prescription coverages work. It's about what the discount is that you can get off of the actual sticker price or rate. So we're actually working through that and looking at it for 2019-20 as a possibility. We've also been working with some of the bargaining units to change copay structures, which reduces percentages on premium. We see it as a way to save both for the employee and for the district. We have 3 of our bargaining units that actually did make those changes effective to 18-19, and that saved about $42,000 going into next year. So again, if you look at it in that FTE range, that's a little over half of a position that was not reduced based on those changes. The other thing with trying to go to those copay changes is to get to what we would call a universal plan, which is something that Kashyyyk-wide and our health insurance consortium would reduce some of the admin costs and some of the federal taxes that we pay when we're kind of out there as individuals. So, those are some of the things looking forward to try to mitigate, but felt like it was important to give some perspective on kind of our overall health insurance costs and where they are relative to the last few years. Obviously not great, but overall we still think we're in the right place and we still need to stay the course. So if we look at the Center for Advanced Technology, again, that's one of the questions that we've heard a lot from the community. So just overall, one of the things when we did this project was that we talked about estimating about $250,000 in rental costs per year that we hope to get in revenue from the center. Where we're at for next year is more like $450,000. And so that's obviously $200,000 more than where we started and estimated, but also if you look at the actual expenses that we have to run the building, which includes heat and electric and the Mohonasen portion of any of the employees there, that's about $262,000. So there's $188,000 more in revenue that the district has because that building was built, which if you break that down, it's about 2.5 full-time equivalents. So I know on the surface what looks like something that might be eating up money and the reason that we have to lay people off is actually quite the opposite, that there's 2.5 positions that exist because of the fact that we've done the CAP building and because of the fact that we have the relationships that we do right now with BOCES. And I'm going to try to get through these last couple relatively quickly, but when we look at the staffing reductions, and I alluded to it earlier, there's a question, are we reducing in kind of in all areas in the same proportion? So one of the things that we looked back and did is kind of looked at an older, I'll call high point of 2007-8 with teaching positions, and you'll see that it was also similar with admin. So 245 teaching positions and about 15 administrative positions, and that ratio is about 16.3 of teachers to administrators. When we went through our very difficult financial times and had all the layoffs, you'll see that it was 218 and 13 FTEs within admin, which increased it to about 16.8. And then if we go into next year with what we're looking at, you see it's 233 teachers, and about 14 and a half admin positions, so 16.1 again for a ratio. So those have stayed pretty similar. And one of the things that is important to put on here is, we opened a new building, so we needed an administrator to run that building. We didn't necessarily hire new staff. We had one technology teacher position that was added based on some of the programming, but a lot of the staff were relocated from the high school building, but there is an administrator that we share the cost with over there to be able to run the building. So that would be at 14 if kind of all else was equal, but at 14 and a half, you see where those ratios are. This is another one that it kind of looks at the elementary level positions, and you'll see that similar trend. And, you know, it's not hard to look back and say, when did we go through the really difficult financial times? When was the gap elimination adjustment restored? Because you can see when those positions went back up. So this is relative to how many sections did we have kindergarten through 6th grade in these years. And you can see where those jumps happen. If you look back to 12, 13, it stayed relatively consistent, and a lot of that was due to you know, just changes in enrollment and moving sections and FTE of staff around. And then you'll see where the board made that dedicated effort to increase sections, decrease class sizes down to 21.5. And so what we're looking at right now for 18-19, although relative to what we had in 17-18, is certainly not where we want to be, it's also very consistent where we had been prior to this. So if you look at those 4 years, the first 4 years on the chart, where the class sizes or the class sections were in the high 50s, we're actually at 60 looking at 2018-19, and depending on where that elementary kindergarten section, whether or not that needs to be added, could be at 61. So just a little bit of perspective. As far as fund balance, which is our next topic, we have $2 million right now between fund balance and reserves that are allocated to this year's budget, the $53 million budget. And so that's basically money that the district has that when you put into the budget, you hope not to use, not to deplete, but it's there if you need it. Our estimate is that out of that $2 million, probably $700,000 or so will be depleted and not be able to be replenished the following year. So that creates obviously a long-term concern. And so every dollar that you add then to that is another dollar that you not only make up in 18-19, but continues on into 19-20 and beyond. And one of the concerns that we have is as we look at our revenues and expenses over the last several years, especially after the GEA had been restored, is we have them growing at different rates, and our expenses are growing much faster than our revenues. And if they continue to do so, and they're about 3% right now for our expenses and 2% for revenues, that creates an additional $500,000 per year that would be added to that gap. So to just say that we could take $1 million from fund balance and fund it and we'd be done, if that was a one-time cost because all the roofs caved in the district, we could absolutely do that, knowing that the next year that cost goes away. But not only would the cost not go away, it would continue to escalate each year and just create a larger and larger gap. So based on our current projections and what we have allocated within the budget to fund balance and reserves, we would be looking at 6 or 7 years of depleting the entire fund balance and reserves that the district has. If we tried to bridge this gap with fund balance, then we'd be looking at more like 2 to 3 years where those would be totally depleted and be able to put nothing toward the budget. So it becomes a very difficult balancing act. And it's important to note in the 17-18 budget, one of the things that we did do was the board and the district allocated another $350,000 from fund balance to be able to continue to add positions with the hope that we'd have some of this turnaround in foundation aid, which is the next piece that we'll talk about. So foundation aid is what is considered basically the minimum amount that a district needs to be able to educate the students that they have. And it's based on a lot of different pupil needs, whether it be special education and poverty and different learning needs, and then the number of students that you have. So even though it's not being fully funded right now, they continue to run the formula. So districts are aware of what they should be getting if the formula was running. So just as an example for 18-19, it would be $16.7 million, and instead Mohonasen is getting $13.6 million. So it's $3.1 million for 18-19 that we are short on foundation aid. And there's a lot of discussions that can happen as to whether or not that formula is accurate, needs to be tweaked. I'm sure that it does, but it does kind of highlight the idea that there's a pretty significant discrepancy. And if you remember when we had all the layoffs before, it was when the gap elimination adjustment was being implemented, and that was a couple of $1 million per year for Mohonasen. So it's a very similar thing, and if this is reinstated, obviously it would take care of a lot of things. It doesn't change the fact that you want the trajectory of your revenues and your expenses to be similar and not discrepant from each other, because that causes problems no matter what, but it's certainly a major issue. So the last one, and maybe the most important though, is, well, why Mohonasen, why now? And you know, some of it's based on the decisions that we've made, which we made in good faith. You know, and I alluded to one a minute ago of, you know, the idea of allocating extra fund balance to continue to bring down class sizes with the idea that kind of a leap of faith to say, hey, you know, we believe that, first of all, we think our health insurance costs that spiked in that year weren't going to happen again, and obviously they did. Also the idea that with the GEA totally restored, the understanding that the next thing on the plate would be foundation aid, which would obviously make a huge difference. And then when we look at other districts, and we've had a lot of conversations, Dr. Spring and I have had a lot of conversations with other business officials and superintendents, and one of the factors, and it's just one because all of these fit into it, is some districts have significant retirements that causes a reduction in the payroll and some of the benefits that they have that creates that little bit of breakage. And when that happens, there's not as many staff to lay off. We've had some retirements in our support staff and some in our administration, but not a lot and not as many as some of the other districts. But they know too, they say when we start not getting retirements, this formula is not set up to work. So, unfortunately, I think all schools will eventually be there. We're there right now because of some of the things that we've done, but, they've all been done with an understanding that this is a possibility, and then we've had some relatively bad fortune, I'll say, after a bunch of good fortune with some of the things like our health insurance costs. So, all through the Q&A now, I mean, we've looked at the proposed bus purchase request many times now, but this is another thing that will be on the ballot next week on Tuesday, and basically it's 6 buses, 3 full-size, which are now 72-passenger buses, which is essentially 1 extra row of seats, and then 3 smaller buses to get down some of the roads and take some of the special runs that we need to. And then one of the things that many of you are here for tonight, we have Board of Education vacancies. We have Morgan Beach, Pamela Young, Wade Abbott, and Patrick Ryan, who you guys will hear from in a moment here. And last but not least, the contingent budget is something that we speak about every year and luckily haven't had to go to, but it's also really important to review. And the idea of a contingent budget would be is if the budget is voted down, either once and the board chooses not to go out for another vote, or twice, you go to a contingent budget, which essentially means that any of the revenue that would have been from taxes, you cannot do. You have to go to a 0% tax increase, which would mean cutting another $850,000 or so from the budget, which would be that 10 to 12 total positions. Any questions from anyone? All right. Sorry, I know that's a lot of stuff to go through relatively quickly, but we wanted to make sure to review all those items with everyone. This presentation will be up on the website if you want to review any of that kind of Q&A, and if you have questions, you can feel free to contact us. But without further ado, you guys will meet the candidates. Oh, I'm sorry, the vote is May 15th from 7 to 9 in the high school gym. Now you're going to meet the candidates. Thank you.
Can we stop it for a minute? Okay, I'd like to invite the candidates to come down.